Okay, good morning. Time now a minute past 8 a.m. On Friday, January 19th, 2024. Welcome to another edition, actually the very first edition of the morning seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office in 2024. This is the series of the online seminars that we feature the latest report put together by the World Bank, presented by the authors of those reports. This morning, we are featuring the new report titled The Reality Check, subtitled Lessons from 25 Policies Advancing a Low Carbon Future. We have one of the co-authors of the report connecting from Washington, Thomas Carr, who is the World Bank's South Asia region's climate senior lead climate change specialist, connecting us this morning. Tom, good morning, good evening. Can you hear me well, right?
Yes, hello Koichi. Nice to be with
Okay,
you.
great. Great, thank you very much. So, as usual, we are going to listen to Tom presenting the main point of the report for probably 35 minutes. Then after that, I'll read the questions that we received from the audience. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please send your question by using the form posted on the announcement of this seminar on the website, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. I'll read your question after Tom's presentation, asking Tom to respond. So with that, I would now like to formally invite Tom to come in to start the presentation. Tom, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Koichi, and very nice to be with you all. And on behalf of my co-author, Stefan Haugat, and myself, very glad to see the interest in the report. This is a report that we released last September. And essentially what it does is, we are always looking forward and trying to look at climate change in the future and what the impacts might be and what the policies we might need to do to reduce emissions and to manage the impacts of climate change. But this actually is looking backward. This is a unique report. It's actually, we've been at this policy making for over 30 years. Countries have been trying to put in place different climate change policies. And so it tries to look back at what we have learned from the implementation of these policies. We have seen many different markets get created around the world for solar and wind and electric vehicles now and other sorts of innovations. But we don't often know exactly what was the sort of the secret to success, and how did these countries or these governments navigate the politics and get the policies in place. And so we released this report to try to fill that research gap, to do some study of exactly what we've learned. So I'm going to walk you through some of the key messages, and then as Koichi said, happy to hear your questions and have a discussion. And so I think the first point of the report is that, we are very happy with the Paris Agreement. It was very ambitious. Every country submitted its pledges. We then, following on the Paris Agreement in 2015, many countries have now even gone further and announced net zero pledges, I think over 70 countries. And that's all very good, but the harsh reality is we're still not on track to bend the curve and to flatten emissions and to get to the point we need to get to achieve the 2 degree or even the 1.5 degree Celsius sort of climate stabilization. And so this, we're still we had a stock take report this year at the Dubai COP that was very harsh and sort of, warning countries around the world, we really need to step up ambition. Despite a small reduction during the pandemic in emissions related to the shutdown of aviation and transport and other activities, now emissions are back up again. And current models estimate that the policies that are in place just on the back of these Paris Agreement and the net zero are still insufficient. And so we need to do more to, basically we'd be almost nearing a 3 degree warming still globally, which is not anywhere near where we need to be. We need to be, again, towards the 2 degree or the 1.5 degree target. So I think the other key point is that, we know that the rich countries, the developed countries that have committed a lot of the emissions, are really important, and they have to act first and reduce their emissions. they can't do it alone. If all low-income countries or lower and middle-income countries just did what they were doing at the business as usual path, while everybody else did net zero, we still would see the greenhouse gas emissions leveling out not until 2050, and we would still see global temperatures rise above 2.5 degrees Celsius. So we need the larger emitters, China, India, parts of Africa, and Latin America. They also need to do their part. And so that's why this report really is a global report. We're looking at experiences around the world. We aren't pointing the finger and saying one country is more than another. We really try to develop these case studies and the examples so every country could benefit, because everybody needs to reduce their emissions. I think, as I mentioned in my introduction, I think some good news is that policies are leading to increasing penetration of low carbon solutions. So you can see here it's a study that was done by a consultancy a couple of years ago. It was called the Paris Effect. And it was looking at the effect of the Paris Agreement on creating new markets for clean energy and other technologies. And you can see here the sort of color coding is, market penetration, where it's sort of at mass market or late market is what we want to be achieving. So that's the green and the dark green. And you can see already that in 2020, low carbon power has achieved that status in terms of the costs. It's competitive in most settings. It's getting widely. It's really more of a scaling than a demonstration phase. We then see in 2030 that sort of the green spreads to light road transport, building and heating, trucking, agriculture, and land use change, which is a much larger set of technologies. And you see, we're already seeing that happen. For example, probably the strongest cases, we've seen wind and solar for many years, but now electric vehicles are coming along very quickly, especially for passenger vehicles and for 2- and 3-wheelers, where they're getting a very low cost and very rapid adoption in many countries. So I think there is correlation between the policy development that created the right enabling environments, and then you can see the market penetration here. Then we wanted to look at so that we saw all these policies, we wanted to know exactly how many policies and where are they coming from. So we worked with this group that does I think it's at Oxford University, that does a new climate database, and it basically tracks climate policy announcements around the world on an annual basis. And you can see here the sort of blue jagged line is the number of annual policies. So each year, which policies are being announced. And you can obviously see around COP15 in Copenhagen and then 21 in Paris, where there were big spikes because there was that sort of political pressure to come to the COP with a policy announcement with some pledges. So you saw spikes in those years, but then the purple line shows just cumulatively over the years how many policies are being announced. And you can see over 4,500, so 4,500 policies have been announced globally since the 1980s. So, and there's been a huge growth in the number of policies that are being announced. And you are starting to see a little bit of a plateau or a flattening of that line, because countries, a lot of countries have done a lot of policies and they're now more into the implementation phase. In terms of trends, I think the other thing we noted was that, as you might expect, the higher income countries led in a lot of the policy announcements first. You can see on that left graph, the darker line, in the 1990s and 2000, large growth in number of policies announced. But then you see, starting in about a decade or 15 years later, many of the other countries have been following on and announcing more and more policies. One of the more interesting things that I got from the report is that actually the leading country right now in announcing new climate policies globally is India. And so you're seeing, the other countries are catching up and realizing that they need to put more policies in place to reduce emissions across different sectors. The other point is just to look at the sectoral focus of these policies. So the policies include, very things like emissions trading or carbon taxes, very specific climate policies, but they also would include like a renewable energy feed-in tariff or an electric vehicle buyback mandate, because these are considered climate policies as well, and those are sectoral policies. You can see here as well, early on, a lot of the energy, obviously the power and heat and buildings led, but then we're starting to see more economy-wide targets, I guess, tied to the Paris Agreement and NDCs, as well as agriculture and forestry is starting to pick up in the later years. And so for the report itself, we thought there's so many different policies going out that we wanted to create a bit of a typology to categorize the different types of decarbonization policies that countries are using. And so we created sort of 5 groups. The first group is a broader group around planning for a future with zero net emissions. And this is sort of the long-term planning, long-term targets. Then following the sort of economy-wide long-term targets, you then set sector-specific and shorter-term targets to achieve those long-term targets. You look at how do you track progress and monitor and update and modify policies as needed, and then learning and feedback around those policies. So that's kind of a group of general policies. The second one is really the economic incentives, so getting the prices right, we call that. And so obviously this includes carbon pricing, carbon taxing, cap and trade, but also things like fossil fuel subsidies, agricultural subsidies that are still encouraging more heavy emitting fuels and agricultural practices, as well as things like market-based mechanisms that are maybe more related to sometimes there's like renewable energy trading certificates or other energy efficiency trading certificates that can be used, and so those are considered market-based mechanisms and get the prices right. The third is probably the largest bucket, and this includes basically all those sectoral transitions. We want to transition the sectors from high carbon to low carbon and more efficient. And so we have sort of 2 subgroups within that. One is we call supply push policies that are really helped to try to get the technologies to market by reducing the costs. So you're doing research and you're doing pilot projects and you're trying to get these demonstrated and out into the market, so then they take up and become cost competitive. And then the second one is more of a demand pull to help consumer demand. So these are things like electric vehicle, consumer credits to buy electric vehicles, or building codes and standards and things like that to get technologies demanded by the customers out in the market. The fourth group is getting the finance flowing. So this is really a broad group around how do you attract financing for low carbon solutions, and these include, and private sector in particular, includes things like concessional finance and blended finance that are public finance that's used to leverage much larger amounts of private finance, as well as green taxonomies, and you hear a lot about ESG in the financial sector now, and also looking at climate related risks, which has become a bigger issue around things like both on the physical side, but also on the sort of stranded asset side, where you have heavy investment in fossil fuels, and now companies and governments are looking at we don't want this to be a stranded asset that has no value because we're phasing this technology out. The final bucket is around ensuring a just transition, and so you probably heard this term. It's really about how there's a lot of jobs and livelihoods tied up with fossil fuel use in particular, and so how do we transition the vulnerable populations that are make their living off of these sorts of agriculture or coal or other sort of fossil fuels, and create jobs and skill transfers, and also community engagement around what the new jobs might be and how to transfer that skill set to those jobs. So then the other point that we wanted to make too that's really important, I think, and I really want to focus on this, is that in all of our research on the policies, in a lot of cases, the number one reason for doing the policy was not decarbonization or to reduce carbon or methane or other greenhouse gas emissions. It was because the policy actually had very strong other co-benefits, other development impacts. And so you can see here a sampling of some of the case studies in the report, where they, for example, in Mexico, they did a methane capture from waste. But one of the main drivers was it was an explosion hazard at the landfill. It was a safety issue and an air pollution issue. And then it also created a new source of renewable energy that had some value. So it wasn't just about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think in India and many of the countries in South Asia with high urban pollution, they see that there's a huge push for better air quality, and so that is a big driver for traffic and transport policy, as well as phasing out fossil fuels. And I won't go through all of these, but I think there are other drivers that really can help to put these policies in place. And this is really important for the sort of political economy of the policy. So as you try to sell the policy and promote it to some of the affected industries, it's very important to highlight some of the other benefits that will come, and we can talk more about that as well. I think finally, before I'm going to just touch on there's several case studies, and I'm just going to touch on 2 case studies in the report. Finally is lessons learned and next steps. So I think this is the beginning of a sort of a research program that we're going to be building on. First, to note that this is a decarbonization policy report, so it's looking just at emissions mitigation policies. We are now starting to scope out a report that would do similar treatment for adaptation and resilience policies, because that's obviously a huge need as well, especially in the developing world, or even more in the developing world than the developed world. And so that's an area, a gap that we are going to fill. But I think in terms of the policy sort of transitions and the evolution of policymaking, we're definitely seeing more countries go from just incentivizing one particular technology or sector to looking more economy-wide at, how do I optimize my emissions reductions across sectors. Secondly, I think the long-term targets are helping to then, I think many countries put out their NDC or their net zero target, but now they really are putting in place, okay, what do we do? How do we achieve that 50-year target in the next 5 years? I think one very important point too is that some people might say, well, is this best practice? And I think that's a very difficult sometimes term to define. But I think our sense was that this is really not best practice. It's just that's why it's called reality check, because it's real world. This is what happened in the real world. Some of these policies had to be compromised and changed because of political issues in the country, and it gets into the just transition and some of the stakeholder concerns, and that's an absolutely critical part of policymaking. And in fact, Stefan and some colleagues authored a follow-on report that ties to this one later last fall as well, that looks in depth at sort of decarbonization and the political economy. What are some of the political issues around things like phasing out coal and putting in electric vehicles? And so if you're interested in that, I encourage you to talk to Koichi, or we can send you a link to that report. But it's very important to every country has its own unique political issues, and it's very important for these policies to navigate that. And sometimes, as I said, using some of those other benefits that are delivered by the policies. Another point was just capacity building is really important. You can't just drop the policy in and not have building engineers that can monitor building codes and make sure that they're being enforced. And I think sometimes you have to adapt the policies. The policies in this report that are in the case studies are not going to be perfectly suited. You always have to adapt them when you bring them to a new country. I think finally, there's the biggest issues really are the investment, the cost of some of these technologies they're not in that green bar that I was pointing out earlier. So there is still a need to reduce the costs and to deliver financing, especially private financing for a lot of these technologies. And I mentioned the political economy issues. And then finally, more on this sort of research side is that we found a big gap. It's still very difficult to look at causality between the policy and the actual greenhouse gas reductions or the other job creation or some of the other benefits. And so we are recommending more research, and we'd like to actually collaborate with partners that are interested in evaluating policies after they're implemented to really see what the impact was ex post rather than before the policy is issued. Because it's really important to really understand what the actual impact was, and then that can help design, the future policy design as well. And then I mentioned as before, we're going to continue to collect, and if people have good examples of other case studies that should be collected, this will be kind of a living library. And then, as I said, we're going to be expanding to adaptation and resilience in the future. And so before I open it up, I'll just go through, there were 25 case studies around the world, different countries and different levels of income, as well as different sectors, going from transport to agriculture to finance sector to power and energy. But I wanted just to highlight two that I was more involved with. You can see here there's a study, case study on Costa Rica. This is an economy-wide approach that they use to mitigate and to implement their NDC. I think it's fascinating that the case study on Egypt reforming their fossil fuel subsidies and how they were able to do that successfully through a combination of outreach and working with, this is a very political issue, as everybody knows, but they were able to navigate that well. And then I wanted to focus on solar because, as Koichi said, I authored this report, but I also am responsible for South Asia. So I wrote this case study, and I was fascinated because I used to work at the International Energy Agency many years ago. And 10 years ago, India was not on the map on solar power. And you look today, they're I think the fourth or fifth biggest solar power market in the world. And I wanted to know how did that happen? That was really one of the genesis for this whole report. And we really studied what India did was a very multi-pronged approach. So they started with launching the solar mission in 2010, which is kind of a government priority. It gave political attention. They put resources behind it and created a coordination node in the government. But then they offered they had a feed-in tariff, which is a subsidy to solar power, as well as so that was a carrot, but then a stick of utility power purchase obligation. So if you're a utility, you had to buy a certain percentage of renewable energy. So that created a demand. But then also they created other fiscal incentives. And land, they offered some land for large solar parks and other tax incentives to get in the private sector investment that was needed. I think their primary objective was to decarbonize energy, but they have seen a significant air pollution reduction and a green job creation. Now, this is a vibrant industry now in India, and in fact, now they have been buying a lot of panels from China, but now they're looking to produce their own. They're creating a domestic manufacturing of solar, which is another job creation. And I think it really created, because they had this broad platform that was owned by the central government, it created a real momentum behind it. And I think you can see in the graph here, India has attracted almost $90 billion cumulative solar investment over this period, and it's really a vibrant place for new expectations. And now they're looking at things like replicating this for doing a green hydrogen mission and things like that. So that's one case study. I think the other one I wanted to highlight was getting the finance flowing in Kenya. And for me, this one, I didn't write this one, but I knew enough about it, so I wanted to present it because I thought it was fascinating that Kenya is now really one of the more attractive markets in Africa for private sector investment. But this wasn't always the case. I think back about 15, 20 years ago, they were actually having very difficult macroeconomic policies, and they had struggling utilities that were state controlled, and they wanted to reform that and create a more enabling environment. That was the main goal. And so they did this energy power sector reform, and now you can see from the graph here that they've basically reduced their oil power generation, and they've really dramatically ramped up geothermal and also hydropower and now wind. And now they're seeing a lot of benefits in terms of decarbonization with air pollution reduction, but also energy access, job creation, and other development. And it was really, this is now a good example for a lot of countries want to reform and privatize their state-owned utilities, and this is one example where Kenya was able to do that. The other case studies was talking about the transition in South Africa around their coal sector, and then here is the link for the report. I won't go through. As I said, there's 25 case studies, but I'm happy to take questions now, and hope this was interesting to you, and look forward to the discussion, Koichi.
Thank you very much, Tom, for the presenting the main point of the report, including some of the case studies among the 25 of those case studies included in the report. We received some questions from the audience in advance. I have my sunshine in front of me, so it's difficult to see the screen now. But let me read those questions and asking you, Tom, to respond. The first one, question from Rita-san from the University of Tokyo. Let me read Rita's question. What are the strategies to mitigate the CO2 emissions from low and middle income countries where people are still destroying nature in the name of urbanization? So this is a question from Rita. Any comment response? Tom, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so I see that very actively in South Asia, where there's such a really rapid urbanization. Many rural populations are not able to make a living, so they're going to the city areas and the sort of outer cities, and they're really, as you say, there's a lot of destruction of nature to build settlements and things like that. And so I think a lot of it is around urban planning, and trying to make sure that these citizens have, rather than destroying some of the nature, can benefit from it. So we are seeing some more, these agriculture cooperatives and climate smart agriculture that are coming in to create jobs on the sort of outskirts of communities. And we're also seeing you may have heard the term nature-based solutions, which are in an urban setting. So like in the Colombo in Sri Lanka, it's a very wetland city. It gets flooded a lot, and there was a lot of citizens that were moving around and dealing with nature, and many because of flooding. And so they did put in place a nature-based solution approach that really invested in, rather than sort of what we call gray or hard infrastructure of more seawalls and more hard ports and infrastructure, they invested in mangroves and other sorts of more soft nature-based buffers that are now, stabilizing, and they're more resilient to these storm surges. And now the citizens are, it gives then the migrants aren't moving so much, and you're not seeing as much nature be destroyed. I think there are people, if you're in a biodiverse areas as well, there are nature finance is becoming kind of a new hot source of finance, and so that's another source of potential of revenues to protect some of these areas that have a lot of nature or natural resources, rather than tearing them down. But then you have to be able to document, where were you before and where did you come afterwards, and then you can attract that financing. So those are a couple thoughts I have to respond to that one.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom, for your responses. Let me read the second question, the question from Takahashi-san. Thank you very much for your question. As mentioned in the report, South Africa is one of the countries assisted under JET program, JET-P. What are the key takeaways of the coal phase out? How can DFIs, development finance institutions, facilitate such phase out? How can carbon credit and blended finance play a role in such phase out? So this is a question. These are the questions from the Takahashi-san. Tom, any comments?
Yeah,
Please?
that's a really, really important question that is being discussed a lot in many coal-based economies, so Indonesia, South Africa, and India, and others. And I think South Africa has this program, and you probably are referring as well, the JET-P, and then I think there was I want to say, I'm not exactly sure, but I think $8 billion was pledged from the EU countries to help accelerate its coal phase out. So there's a lot of resource that's needed in terms of finance, but then the challenge is, to be honest, is I think some of that finance has been slow and actually flowing to South Africa. And so I think your question gets to how do you actually make this happen in a practical way, and it's a very challenging problem. I think one example I've heard of that is sort of a possible solution that could be scaled up was in the country of Chile. There was a 100 megawatt coal-fired power plant, and I believe that there was the French utility named Engie owned that coal-fired power plant, and Engie it's a private operator. They had a net zero target at a global level for their emissions, and so we actually are the climate investment funds, which is part of the World Bank Group, came into the deal, and essentially what the idea was, could we close the 100 megawatt coal-fired power plant and replace that with a 100 megawatt wind farm? And then we started doing the calculations for what would the carbon reductions be, and what would that cost of carbon be. And it turned out to be an amount that the CIFs, the climate investment funds, could subsidize. And so that deal is now in implementation, and they're making that happen. And so that's only 100 megawatts. It's a much smaller coal-fired power. Most coal-fired power plants are 10 times larger than that. so it's a lot more money, but I think it's one example that we can get more creative with this kind of carbon finance, and I think that's one thing I know my colleagues over at the CIFs are trying to replicate.
Thank you for your responses. Let me read the question that we received during your presentation. Question from Sasaki-san. Thank you for your question as usual. Let me read. How does the World Bank support the developing countries to introduce and implement the decarbonization policy and collaborate with other donors, UN agencies, and multilateral development banks? So the collaboration with other partners. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So I used to be at the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm, and I know we did a lot of work on sort of country platforms with other development finance agencies and tried to coordinate, how we could enter in and support different elements of the sector's transformation. And I know that's a very popular, that's one way that can work, is this sort of development cooperation at the country level. And I think one other way that is we're starting to see some traction with is, you may be familiar, the World Bank Group about 2 years ago started to do, as part of our sort of transition to this, reducing poverty, ending poverty on a livable planet, which is the kind of World Bank's new logo, or a vision statement. So that really puts climate and development on equal footing. We then realized we needed a diagnostic at a country level to understand, what does that mean? For this particular country, how do you balance development and climate and optimize that? And so there's a new report that we're doing in every one of our client countries, and we've already done about, I think, 30 of these globally, and then there's another 30 underway right now. They're called a Country Climate and Development Report, or a CCDR, and you can get these on our website. And it's basically a very intense process. I know well, because I'm actually responsible for 4 of these this year, including India. And you basically have to look at the entire economy, where the country's trying to go in terms of job creation and sector growth and poverty alleviation, and then look at the climate impacts that are happening to the economy, and how those are expected to change in the future, and what the impact might be. And then the decarbonization is overlaid on as well, like how are they going to shift emissions to meet their targets. And then throughout that process, you identify certain priorities, or like you might see a red flag or a gap where they don't have a policy in place. Like I know some countries don't, they have, all of a sudden we start to see they have very large industrial sector emissions, but they really don't have policies to address that industrial sector emissions. So then we can identify interventions in the forms of policies or investments that governments can take. And so we've started to see that CCDR, development partners are coming together and saying, okay, this is a really good tool, and this helps me with my, okay, I'm going to focus on this particular sector or this particular policy or investment, and then other ones are doing the same. So we're hoping to create more of these country platforms using the CCDR as kind of an organizing principle. And so that's another way that we can work with JICA and with other development partners.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. You responded to the questions that we received in very efficient manner, and also presented the report in a very efficient manner. So before wrapping up the sessions, I would like to ask you, Tom, to share with us a very final thoughts, final messages, anything that you didn't mention, but you just wanted to mention to the audience, please.
Yes, no, thank you. I appreciate it, and I'm glad that we had a good discussion. And I mean, actually, because I said that I was at IEA, I did work a lot with Japan back when I was there. And Japan actually is a very fascinating example. We have one case study in the report on industrial energy efficiency, because it's seen the Top Runner program and some of the success it's had with that. I would love to hear from you, and if you can think about it and send Koichi or me a note, but if you have other examples of where Japan or other countries that Japan is working with has a good case study or example that you think is reducing emissions and should be showcased, because we're looking for other examples. And it's always helpful to talk to the people that know the country the best and can tell us, here's a good policy that should be replicated, and then we can share that with our audience. As I said, this reality check series is going to be, a living document that will continue to grow and add case studies as we go forward. So, so that's an ask of you. If you have any good examples of Japan's leadership or other countries in the region, please send them our way, and we'll be happy to collect them.
Thank you, Tom. Actually, while you are making the final report, I see Shimamoto Sensei, Professor Shimamoto from Kyoto, posted on one comment. Let me read. Can you comment on the usability of the indicators other than CO2 emissions? Anything you have in your mind, Tom, please make a comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets to what I was pointing out before, these co-benefits. So many policies have, they're not just designed to reduce CO2 emissions, but they have these other very important benefits. And I think really it's about, from the start of the policy design, trying to be, thorough and cover what are the possible benefits, and then how do we set the baseline now before the policy starts to track those. So it could be air pollution benefits. It could be, if you're looking at traffic, like improving traffic in cities, reducing congestion in cities. If it's looking at energy efficiency, capturing the dollar savings or the monetary savings you're getting from reduced energy purchases. And so it's setting up those indicators at the beginning, and then you can, on an annual basis or on a regular basis, track those. And I think it's really important to then communicate those to the community that is regulated or in benefiting, because then they can see that this has, it's not just about CO2, it's actually delivering job creation and other sorts of benefits. So I think it's really about wiring it from the beginning to track as many these indicators as possible, and then also thinking about how do you communicate that to the affected public.
Great, thank you very much. With us this morning, connecting from Washington, we had the Thomas Carr, who is a lead climate change specialist in the South Asia region of the World Bank, presented the new report issued in September last year, Reality Check Lessons from the 25 Policies Advancing a Low Carbon Future. Tom, thank you very much for your time joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi. It was a pleasure, and look forward to following up. Have a good day, everybody.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we are not going to have the morning seminar next week, but on the January 30th, Tuesday, we'll have another round of the morning seminar. That time we are going to feature the new report titled Migrants, Markets, and Mayors, Rising Above the Employment Challenge in Africa's Secondary Cities. This is going to be the Tuesday, January 30th, 8 a.m. So please join us then. So with that, once again, thank you very much and see you next time. Thank you.